Last week we talked about Samson. He's going to be the new judge of Israel, and he was basically set apart by God to rescue Israel from the Philistines. In Judges chapter 14, we're going to see how Samson repeatedly compromises and falls into sin. And we're going to also see how God continues to be faithful in delivering on his promise to set Israel free from the Philistines, despite Samson's repeated mistakes. Okay, so Samson was set apart, if you guys remember. He was set apart by God to rescue Israel from the Philistines. And one of the ways that we know he was set apart was by this thing called the Nazirite vow. And the Nazirite vow basically meant that he was not able to eat anything from the grapevine. So he wasn't able to drink wine, he wasn't able to eat grapes or raisins or anything like that. He was also not supposed to be near any dead bodies, and he was also supposed to not cut his hair. Well, in verses 1 through 9 of chapter 14, where do we find Samson? He's hanging out by the vineyards of Timnah. He's scoping out a wife from the Philistines, from the enemy. He kills a lion, and then sometime later he comes back and finds some honey inside its carcass, and he eats it. I see a young man who is getting absolutely slain by temptation, lust, selfishness, pride. He's breaking his vow. Even though he is set apart by God, he is clearly being tempted, lured, and enticed by his own desires. And those desires eventually lead to sin and to death. In verse 10 through 14, Samson throws a wedding feast. Where? At the vineyard, of course. And he's there for a week, and so the Philistines give him 30 companions to be basically like his men of honor, or like his best man. And he makes a bet with them for 30 sets of clothing. And his bet is basically that they won't be able to solve this riddle that he gives them. And this is basically just another display of his pride and his arrogance. Now, these sets of clothing, it's kind of a big deal. 30 sets of clothing. It was pretty uncommon for people back in this day to have more than 1 or 2 sets of clothing. And these are really expensive and nice clothes. And so in order to own them, you would have had to be really wealthy. Well, it turns out these 30 companions could not solve his riddle. So in verses 15 through 18, these guys basically threaten Samson's new wife. And they tell her, we're going to burn you and your whole family to death unless you go to Samson and coax the answer from him for this riddle. And so Samson caves. He gives his new wife the answer to the riddle. She goes and tells these guys about it, and they come and tell it to Samson. And now Samson has to settle his debt with these guys. And so in verses 19 through 20, basically he goes and he kills 30 wealthy Philistines. He takes their clothes and he gives them to these guys and just goes home in a fit of rage. And then it says that they gave his wife away to one of his companions, one of his best men. So it's just a crazy story, right? And you got to remember, Samson is not the hero. God is the hero. Samson is flawed, right? He breaks his vow, he sins, he lacks good judgment. But God, on the other hand, empowers Samson to protect himself from the lion and from the Philistines. And God is faithful in keeping his promise to deliver Israel from the Philistines. Now, sometimes I feel like it's really hard to understand, why would God continue to use a man such as Samson? And then I remember that God is using me and God is using you. And one of the reasons that I wanted to take us through the book of Judges is because I feel like I really wanted us to be able to talk about how sinful we really are and to talk about how broken we really are. The book of Judges is so authentically real about our sinful flaws as humans. And I hope that this study allows you to really open up and be real and be vulnerable about the sin in your own life. I feel like oftentimes we try to make ourselves like these perfect, pretty little Christians that never do anything bad. But that's just not true. That's not real. I know that that's what God calls us to, like He wants us to live righteous lives, but I don't want us to pretend like we're perfect. Like Samson, we all battle temptation, we all fail, and we all struggle with all kinds of different sin. Samson's story really shows us that even though someone can be chosen and empowered by God, that person can still struggle with sin. Selfishness, pride, lust, revenge, all of those things, right? The point of this story is not to admire Samson. The point of this story is to recognize yourself. We desperately need the rescue of a faithful God in our lives, which is why God sent Jesus, the true judge, to save us. In 1 John chapter 1, verse 8 and 9, it says, "If we say that we have no sin, we deceive ourselves. The truth is not in us. But if we confess our sins, He is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness."